On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which authorized the Department of War to, quote, prescribe military areas from which any or all persons may be excluded for the purpose of protection against espionage and sabotage. What followed was the evacuation and incarceration of over 100,000 Japanese Americans, over two-thirds of whom were citizens. Despite Department of War reports to the contrary, there was no military necessity for the evacuation of Japanese Americans, who, unlike German and Italian Americans, were singled out for their enemy alien status. The reason for Japanese American internment during World War II was a long history of racial discrimination prior to the war, U.S. imperialism on its own soil, and war hysteria that led the United States government to remove constitutional protection from Japanese American citizens, thus placing them in a condition of statelessness. The story of Japanese American internment is a parable about the importance of public vigilance regarding the dangerous combination of racism, imperialism, and the totalitarian atmosphere created by the state of war. The history of race hatred against Japanese Americans is expressed by the rise of anti-Japanese groups in the late 19th century. Race hatred paved the way for mass evacuation of Japanese Americans, which, although it was justified on the grounds of military necessity, was carried out on the basis of race. In 1853, when Commodore Matthew Perry opened trade and diplomatic relations between Japan and the United States, Japanese immigration began to increase significantly. The demand for Japanese laborers was stimulated by the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which prohibited the immigration of Chinese laborers, the Alaskan Gold Rush, and the building of the Seattle-Tacoma Railroad. Japanese immigrants were prohibited from becoming American citizens because the 1790 Naturalization Act limited the right to citizenship through naturalization to, quote, alien, free, white persons. The result of this limitation on participation in the public sphere was the isolation of Japanese Americans and their retreat into the private sphere of home and family. This retreat made the Japanese a convenient target for the race hatred characterized by statements such as the one made by San Francisco Mayor Duval Phelan in 1900, quote,
"The Chinese and Japanese are not bona fide citizens. They are not the stuff of which American citizens can be made. Personally, we have nothing against Japanese, but as they will not assimilate with us and their social life is so different than ours, let them keep at a respectful distance."
In addition to their isolation from society, Chinese and Japanese Americans had physical features that made it easy to cast them in the role of aliens that posed a threat to the American way of life. Following the 1906 Russo-Japanese War, in which Japan demonstrated its military power, the white population of the Pacific coast began to fear an invasion by hordes of Asians. The terror of the Yellow Peril was the perfect fuel for the fire of anti-Japanese propaganda during World War II that would effectively turn 19th century race hatred into 20th century racism. Following the declaration of war against Japan, anti-Japanese propaganda was used to generate support for the war and military enlistment. The atmosphere of war led Lieutenant General John DeWitt to proclaim, quote,
"The Japanese race is an enemy race, and while many second and third generation Japanese born on United States soil, possessed of United States citizenship, have become Americanized, the racial strains are undiluted."
Japanese Americans were considered a priori enemies of the United States, and neither loyalty oaths nor citizenship could liberate them from the classification of enemy that was stamped upon them as a condition of their race. This assumption of the inherent vice of Japanese blood meant that every Japanese American was under suspicion of treason and that all Japanese should be evacuated for national security reasons. The questions raised by the fact that Japanese Americans and not German Americans or Italian Americans were targeted for evacuation from their homes on the West Coast are only partly answered by their obvious non-whiteness. Other answers are evident in the history of American imperialist attitudes towards non-whites. American imperialism is rooted in the notion of manifest destiny, that it is the will of God that the United States spread across the continent. Manifest destiny justified the westward expansion of the United States, even if it meant pushing Native Americans from their lands through violence. In the late 19th century, the fulfillment of manifest destiny made it necessary for the United States to look to islands in the Caribbean and Hawaii and the Philippines in the Pacific. The remoteness of these islands made them less attractive than the areas within the United States that could satisfy the imperialist need for infinite expansion. This land included territory that was owned by the Japanese, who were considered foreign occupiers within the United States. When Japanese immigrants came to America in the 19th century, many of them chose to make their living by acquiring undesirable land such as swamp and desert and converting it into land suitable for farming. Although alien land laws passed in the early 1900s prohibited any alien ineligible for citizenship from purchasing agricultural land or leasing it for longer than 3 years, Issei, first-generation Japanese Americans, circumvented restrictions by purchasing land in the name of their citizen children, the Nisei. By 1920, Japanese American farmers owned or leased 458,056 acres of land. This valuable agricultural land was coveted by nativists in California and across the West who wanted America for whites only. Supporters of Proposition 1, passed in 1920, urged voters to, quote, "Save California, stop absorption of state's best acreage by Japanese through leases and evasions of law." Despite these efforts, Japanese farmers successfully increased their role in the agricultural economy of the West Coast. Some figures estimate that Japanese Americans were responsible for 30 to 40% of California's produce in the early 1940s. The success of Japanese Americans made them the target of anti-Japanese sentiment. The West Coast Japanese were considered as, quote, posing an increasing threat to the prosperity of native farmers and merchants, though still an infinitesimal percentage of the population. Thus, they were expendable both politically and economically. The superfluousness of the West Coast Japanese Americans made them ideal victims for discrimination and relocation, as opposed to their Hawaiian counterparts who were not forced to evacuate because their labor was essential to the economy of Hawaii. The imperialist nature of the internment of Japanese Americans is supported by the fact that the white growers and shippers who expanded in the wake of the evacuation did very well in 1942. Thus, by moving Japanese Americans from the West Coast during World War II, the United States was not motivated by threats to national security, but by race hatred and the economic well-being of white Americans. The decision of the United States government to detain over 100,000 Japanese Americans for reasons of racism and imperialism was a violation of human rights that is chilling in its similarity to the specter of Nazi totalitarianism being fought during World War II. 1 month before the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Special Investigator Curtis B. Munson delivered an intelligence report to the President and the Department of War. In his report, Munson concluded that, quote, "There is no Japanese problem on the coast. There will be no armed uprising of the Japanese. In fact, the Japanese are hampered as saboteurs because of their easily recognized physical appearance. Munson's report would be suppressed by the United States government until long after World War II.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, members of the War Department encouraged the false impression that Japanese spies living on American soil had supplied Japan with information vital to the attack. By the time officials in Washington corrected this misapprehension, fear and hysteria on the West Coast, fueled by race hate and imperialist economic incentives, had laid the groundwork for Executive Order 9066. In the absence of evidence of Japanese-American involvement in Pearl Harbor, Lieutenant General DeWitt delivered a stunning example of doublespeak when he justified the evacuation of Japanese Americans, stating, quote,
"The very fact that no sabotage has taken place to date is a disturbing and confirming indication that such action will be taken."
The very innocence of Americans was offered as proof of their guilt. In order to prove that they were loyal to the United States, Japanese groups such as the Japanese American Citizens League urged all Japanese Americans to comply with the curfew, evacuation, and relocation programs. The JACL's cooperation with the government would create tensions within the Japanese American community, particularly during loyalty reviews conducted in the camps. In February of 1943, the War Relocation Authority created a loyalty questionnaire designed to find Japanese Americans who could help stimulate the war effort and relieve labor shortages. The questionnaire asked adult internees if they would be, quote, willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty, and if they would, quote, swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese Emperor. The second question was particularly difficult for Issei, who were barred from citizenship in the United States and would therefore become stateless persons if they renounced their Japanese citizenship. As a result of the questionnaire, some Nisei were determined eligible for military service and went on to serve in the highly decorated 442nd Regiment and 100th Battalion. Others served as interpreters in the Military Intelligence Service, an agency that reputedly reduced the length of the war in the Pacific by 2 years. While many Japanese Americans challenged Japanese internment by proving their loyalty to the United States in the military, others chose to fight the injustice of Executive Order 9066 through resistance and legal challenges. Min Yasui, a second-generation Nisei born with American citizenship, challenged the constitutionality of the curfew and evacuation orders in Portland, Oregon. The federal judge in Yasui's case, James Alger Fee, was placed in a quandary. Fee wanted to uphold the military necessity of Executive Order 9066, but was unwilling to destroy the constitutional protection to which American citizens are entitled. Fee resolved his dilemma by stripping Yasui of his citizenship. The stateless Yasui was now considered an enemy alien and could be detained without violating the Bill of Rights. Although the Supreme Court would eventually reinstate Yasui's citizenship, the federal court's actions demonstrate the fragility of citizenship protections during time of war. In the cases of Hirabayashi v. U.S. and Karamatsu v. U.S., the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of curfews and evacuations imposed on Japanese Americans on the grounds that, quote, we are at war with the Japanese Empire, and the properly constituted military authorities feared an invasion of our West Coast, and felt constrained to take proper security measures. Ironically, the Korematsu decision would be cited in defense of Nazi war criminals at the Nuremberg Tribunal. The disturbing shadow of totalitarianism over the history of Japanese internment during World War II was created by a government that assumed tyrannical control under the claim of military necessity, an atmosphere in which lies were accepted as the truth, the existence of superfluous individuals who were by nature enemies of the state, and the arbitrary stripping of citizenship that created stateless individuals who fell outside of the protection of the law. These elements demonstrate that the greatest danger to America during World War II was not the threat of foreign attack, but of the collapse of democracy from within. In Eichmann in Jerusalem, Hannah Arendt puts forward the idea that the holes of oblivion that totalitarianism tries to establish are impossible as long as there is one man left alive to tell the story. Stories like the history of Japanese internment are vital not only because of what they tell us about the injustices of the past, but also because they can illuminate the present and give rise to thoughtful action. After all, it is people, not laws, who are the real defenders of human rights.
You're a sap, Mr. Jap, to make a Yankee cranky.
You're a sap, Mr. Jap. Uncle Sam is gonna spank ye.
Wait and see before we're done.
The A, B, C, and D will sink your rising sun.
You're a sap, Mr. Jap.
You don't know Uncle Sammy when he fights for his rights. You'll take it on the lammy,
or he'll wipe the axis right off the map.
You're a slab, happy sap, Mr. Jap.